All right, welcome to the first lecture. This will cover what on your study guide is called the before time and the long, long ago. And we're basically going to look at how Native Americans got here very briefly. And then we're going to look at some early European brushes with North America. And then we'll look at the Spanish, French, and English explorations of North America. And we'll end with the Roanoke disaster. All right, so let me share screen. I'm going to use PowerPoint and just use blank slides as sort of a chalkboard, if you will. I know it's not the most exciting thing to watch videos and look at a static screen, but that's hybrid class for you. Let me blow this up here a little. So when we talk about early America, okay, pre-Revolutionary War, pre-1700s, way back, we're talking about the collision of three broad cultures. I will misspell a lot of words because I am an awful typist. Native Americans. Okay. Now, not every Native American culture was the same. Again, we're talking broadly. White European, okay, and Africans. Now, these three broad groups came here for different reasons and by different means. Native Americans, Europeans having their own reasons for coming here, and then, of course, Africans having a very unpleasant reason for coming here. So we're going to sort of break them down one at a time across this lecture. Actually, with Africans, we'll get to that when we talk about slavery in the New World, which will be in a different video probably next week. So we're mainly going to focus on these two groups, but we will come back and talk about Africa and the Americas soon. As far as Native Americans go, there's a lot of theories about how Native Americans got here. In fact, one historian of ancient America said that ancient American history must often be written with a pencil because it has to be corrected so often. But the basic story we have now, based on what research has been done, about 20,000 years ago, the Earth entered its last known ice age. Technically, we're still coming out of that ice age today. Much of what is now North America down as far as Utah was covered in glacier ice. At some point, probably, as you can see here, 14 to 12,000 years ago, hunters crossed what is called, you can see here, the Bering Land Bridge, okay, which now, this is the Bering Sea, now covers this. But this is what will one day become Russia over here, and then Alaska over here. And so hunters crossed it chasing their food. That was their main reason for crossing the Bering ice land bridge, was for their food. Okay, these are not explorers or scientists. They're just following their food. Okay, wherever the food goes, they're going to follow, basically. All right. So we see here And all this stuff about A2A and D2, that's all genetics and DNA stuff. A lot of the research has been looking for DNA and trying to trace who got here when and all that kind of stuff. But these hunters would have gone back and forth following the food. So you can see an initial group and then some groups coming back, some groups continuing to go forward. But again, this is all about food. They are simply following their food supply. Now, as the earth began to warm up, the ice began to retreat, as you can see here, and land routes began to open up going into what is now Canada, and then land routes coming into what will one day become the United States. There's also a second theory about coastal peoples hugging the coastline in primitive canoes or other water vessels. Okay. But that's the current theory on how Native Americans got here. And again, ancient America, there's, all kinds of new things that are being discovered. So we may have to erase this and write something new eventually. Most of these people who came, again, were hunter-gatherers and remained hunter-gatherers for thousands of years until something called the Neolithic Revolution occurred. Now, we don't know when the Neolithic Revolution occurred in the Americas. In the Middle East, it happened about 12,000 years ago, but we're not sure when it occurred here. The Neolithic Revolution, very simply, is the invention of farming. Okay. These people figured out that rather than having to follow their food, they could grow their own food. And again, we don't know when it happened, and it didn't happen all at once. It probably happened in different places, and then sort of spread. In some places, it may have never happened. This allowed ancient Americans begin building civilization. Okay. And I'm a terrible speller. Ancient. Nope. Yes. This began them to build civilizations, okay? Because when they were nomads, there was no point in building anything permanent, and there wasn't a lot of time. If your main goal for the day is to go out and kill a water buffalo to feed your people, you don't have a lot of time for art or geometry or astronomy or anything like that. But once there was a stable food supply, then we begin to see civilization. So we see things like buildings, we see art, we see writing, we see eventually literature, we see science, we see all those things building because people have a stable food source. Now, it's not everybody who gets to go into art and literature. There's a lot of people who still have to do the food stuff. Probably 90% of people in a area would still be involved in food production, but you'd have 10% who could begin building a civilization, a written language, science, architecture, art, those type of things. All right. So the invention of farming, stable food supply, civilization. Okay, that's the Neolithic Revolution. Now, the native peoples were cut off from the rest of the world. The oceans filled up as the Ice Age drifted back into memory, and the Europeans and the Asians and the Africans knew nothing about these ancient native peoples. So we're going to jump the story several thousand years forward until we get to the first Europeans. It is possible that the Chinese may have reached California sometime in the 600s AD. And possibly the Irish, a few of them may have landed somewhere around Greenland today before 1000, but those are legends. We don't know if they're true or not. The first Europeans that we absolutely positively know that reached the Americas were the Vikings, or the Norsemen, whichever you prefer to use. Around 985 AD, a Viking by the name of Leif the Red landed his people at a place which he named Greenland, which you can see. Let me get rid of this thing here. So you can see Eric landing about here, and then maybe another village right there. We're not sure why Eric did this. There's some fragmentary evidence that he had killed somebody and was fleeing, authorities. And then about 15 years later, so around 1000 AD, his son, hang on, I got these names wrong here. Okay, this is Eric the Red, my bad. And then the son, Leif the Red, or Leif Erikson, landed in a spot he called Vinland, which is right here, just off the coast of Canada. The Vikings were able to stay temporarily in this area because of an event called the Little Optimum. From about 800 to about 1000 AD, the northern hemisphere, that is everything north of the equator, was unusually hot. It was very, very warm. Even up here in Scotland, they were growing grapes to make wine. That's how warm it was. This unusual warmth meant that Greenland and Vinland, which are normally not good places for farming, were acceptable places for farming. So the Vikings were able to scratch out an existence up here because of the weather. The problem, though, for the Vikings is that at about 1000, the temperatures changed again and everything plunged into a little ice age up here in the European area that would last for about 300 years. And so the Vikings' food supply failed, leading the Vikings to abandon their colonies. Once the food supply failed, they could no longer stay in this area, and so they split. Okay. Here's a little bit more in-depth map. Here are some ruins This is a Viking church in Greenland. It was left behind by the Vikings. But again, once this area got cold again, the Vikings were unable to grow sufficient amounts of food, and they had to simply abandon the entire area. Okay. Other European nations were completely unaware of what the Vikings were doing. In fact, we didn't even know that the Vikings had gotten to Vinland, right, until the 1970s. So the rest of Europe really not knowing what this little band of Vikings were doing, concerned with its own issues and its own problems. Once Europe entered that little ice age, that is also a period that is frequently known as the Dark Ages, because once the weather began to change again, there were crop failures, malnutrition, wars, plagues, okay, the Dark Ages. So if you were living in the Dark Ages, if you survived childhood diseases, you had about 30 or 35 years to procreate and to pass along your superior genetics before you would probably die. Again, it was a short, brutal life for most Europeans during that 300-year period. During that period, there were some advancements as we came sort of out of the ice ages, the little ice age. There was some exploration that began to occur after 1300. In particular, was the Silk Road. This is the Silk Road. It's a road, move this box, running from Italy across the Middle East through what was called Persia, now the Iran-Iraq period, across the steppes, out to China. There's another route that goes to India. It was a very dangerous trip, okay? Once you get out of Europe, these people are probably fighting each other. The Ottoman Empire and the Eastern Byzantine Empire are in almost a perpetual death match. Then you have to get across here, again, hoping that nobody kills you. Then there's a particular virulent form of the plague that lives out here. Then you have to bribe all these people out here not to kill you. And then eventually you get to China or India, where there's a lot of spices and silks and those type of things. Then you have to make the trip back. Again, paying these people not to kill you, surviving the plagues, hoping these people aren't at war, and getting back. So you could make a lot of money on the Silk Road, but it was very dangerous. There is a more sea route version that began to develop as well. Right. So trade and exploration did begin to pick up as Europe came out of the Little Ice Age after 1300. Other nations who weren't Italy or the Greeks or the Byzantines wanted to get in on the action. Nations over here like Spain, France, Portugal. Portugal struck out first. In 1450, Portugal began looking for a sea route to India. Right? So is there a way to get from Portugal, which is about right here on the map, all the way to India over here? And so they began making their way down the coast of Africa. Now, they made a lot of money going down the coast of Africa, okay, because they found diamonds and ivory and gold and slaves. And so Portugal, even before they figured out how to get to India, made an awful lot of money off of Africa and its resources. Eventually, the Portuguese, around 1488, the Portuguese figured out how to get around Africa, around the bottom of Africa. And then they started making money on the western coast of Africa. Again, diamonds, ivory, gold, slaves. And then finally, the route to India was finally secured in 1498. So once they figured out how to cross this, which is incredibly dangerous, they spent about 10 years exploring the coast and setting up stations before Vasco da Gama, a name you don't need to know, became the first of the Portuguese to make his way to India and eventually China. So Portugal making quite a bit of money. Now, before the rest of Europe could get into exploration and colonization, there had to be a development. Okay? There had to be one development that allowed for exploration and colonization. Okay? Spain's got to get through this. Britain's got to get through it. France has got to get through it. The Portuguese have already gone through it. It's not gold. It's not money. It's not the blessing of the church. It is the centralization of political power into the hands of a single monarch. Okay? That has to occur before any nation get into exploration and colonization. Okay? Centralization, political power into the hands of a single monarch. This was done in two ways. One was by simply killing people who got in your way, what we call now the Game of Thrones approach. And two, marriage. For Spain, it's going to be marriage. In 1469, the two most powerful families in Spain united. Ferdinand and Isabella married. Okay. So these two kids get married. It unites the two most powerful families in Spain into a single family, a single monarchy. Okay. France will have their own version of this. The British will have their own version of this as well. So how do we get from that to crazy Columbus? Well, there were three things that were maybe not three. I'm speaking ahead of myself, but there were reasons why Ferdinand and Isabella were willing to give Columbus a chance. Probably first and foremost is they were extremely envious of Portugal's success. Okay? Portugal was making a ton of money, not only from Africa, but from also its trade with India and China. And Ferdinand and Isabella wanted some of that money. Okay. Second, Spain has a very large army, which was very unusual for that time. And that army needs something to do. Generally speaking, you do not want to have a large army that has nothing to do, because that could lead the army to causing some trouble in your own country. So we got a large army. We needed something to do. Let's ship it overseas and find something for it to do so it doesn't cause any trouble here. So 1492, the sails ocean blue. And in October, Columbus does reach land. Okay, leaving here, catching the trade winds across the Canaries. He lands somewhere in the Bahamas, what's now British Bahamas. And then he kind of goes down to Cuba and flits around there, and then he leaves. Columbus returns in 1493. You can see the second voyage here. And in 1493, the first permanent European settlement is founded, Hispaniola, right here. Okay. So remember, the Viking colony had failed, so it's not a permanent colony, but Columbus comes in and sets up the first one here at Hispaniola. You can see here the other 5 journeys of Columbus. He's down here in South America. He's over here in Central America. All right. For the first quarter century after Columbus, more or less, let's say about 1493 to 1515, the Spanish are in the Caribbean. We'll come back and talk about the English later, but let's talk about the Spanish. You have Ponce de Leon going up to Florida for spring break. You have some others who are sort of going along this region, others around here, some others in the Yucatan Peninsula. All of the natives that they're finding are telling them about the gold that is somewhere else. Native Americans living, particularly along the ocean, figured out very quickly that the easiest way to get the Spanish to leave was to tell them that the gold was just over that way. Yeah, you can't miss it. There's gold. There's gold that way. If you leave now, you can probably get there before the sun goes down. Thanks for stopping by. So there were these incredible stories about golden cities and about golden lakes and El Dorado and all of these wonderful stories about gold, gold, gold somewhere in Mexico. So in 1517, Hernan Cortez decided to go into Mexico to find the gold. Man, did he find it. Cortez discovered Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. The Aztecs were the largest tribe in central Mexico. There were probably 5 to 6 million Aztecs. They had built their capital. It had these causeways that could be taken up during fighting. It was the cleanest city any European had ever seen. There was a sewage system that took waste out of the city. It had a fresh water system that brought water into the city as well. It was the largest city that any European had ever seen. It was laid out at perfect right angles. All the streets were exactly the same width. Everything turned at exact right angles. So it was not like these European streets that sort of get wider and thicker and meander. The center of Tenochtitlan was the temple complex. This is what we think it looked like. Okay. Limestone all along here. In these buildings, particularly this building, there was a gold glaze that was painted onto the limestone. So when the sun hit that building, it would shine like a gold bar. And all of the people who lived in the valley surrounding Tenochtitlan would know that the center of the universe was here and it belonged to the Aztecs. It was a massive piece of construction. It is all gone now. In 1520, thanks to smallpox, the Aztec Empire fell, and this was all torn down because it was all pagan idolatry. So it was all torn down. All of the books that the Aztec had, the gold was stripped out of them, and then the books were destroyed. The art had all the gold stripped out and the jewels, and it was destroyed because, again, it was all pagan idolatry according to the Spanish. And these buildings were all just torn down, and it's just gone. It's just gone. After the collapse of the Aztec Empire, the Spanish began moving into what will one day be the United States. There are 3 expeditions that move into the United States that we need to talk about. So let's talk about them. The first one that you're probably familiar with because you grew up here in Texas, more than likely, is De Vaca and Estevanico. This is 1528 to 1536. De Vaca is Spanish. Estevanico is African. He is probably the first African American in Texas. These guys were shipwreck survivors. They're shipwrecked here around south of Houston, and they pretty much lived in this area working as either slaves or as medicine men. Eventually, they decided they wanted to leave, and so you can kind of follow their journey based on what De Vaca wrote later. And then here they ran into a Spanish patrol, and that sent them right back to Mexico City. Mexico City is built on the ruins of the old Aztec capital. Once there, De Vaca wrote a book about everything he had seen amongst the natives, somewhat of an amateur anthropologist, what the natives were like, how they lived, et cetera, et cetera. All that the people in Mexico cared about was whether he had found any gold, and he had not. And so they didn't really care about his anthropology since there was no gold to be found. But that's the first expedition. The second expedition kind of built off of that one, and that is de Coronado, from about 1540 to 1542, coming here from Compostela and splitting up. Some of his men went off and found the Grand Canyon, the first Europeans that we're aware of. He got in here into New Mexico, and the natives in New Mexico just kept telling him that the gold was just further that way. You can't miss it. Lots of gold. Specifically, they said there was gold way out here. So he and his men, they found the Palo Duro Canyon, so the first Europeans, but then they wind up in Kansas, which I imagine the natives back here in New Mexico found hysterical. There is no gold in Kansas. They did find oil, and they found what they called shaggy cows, which of course are buffalo, but they did not find any oil. So you can see their return back here, and then eventually that's their trip. And then the third is this guy named De Soto, 1539 to about 1542. He lands in Florida, and his journals, he talks about these incredibly scary lizards, giant lizards that kept coming out of the swamps and grabbing the men. So an introduction to Florida's native species. Then he kind of wanders through Georgia and the Carolinas, blah, 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 crossing here, looking for gold. And then right around here, he mouthed off to the wrong native and got killed. And at that point, his group split up. Half of his group went off into Texas and were never seen again. And then the other half went down the Mississippi and then just kind of hugged the coastline until they got back to Mexico. So again, no gold. Why do we even mention these? The reason that we mention these particular expeditions, every place where those men stepped was claimed for Spain. So every place that De Vaca went, every place that De Soto went, every place, I'm sorry, that was de Coronado, every place that De Soto went, they claimed that territory for the Spanish sovereign. Okay? So that's why we mention these, because Spain, that's going to allow Spain to claim basically everything from Florida across to Texas and then up into California. Other European nations now began to get in on the action, particularly the French. The main thing Spain found that led everybody else to suddenly come running along was, of course, the gold. Spain found tons of gold. Spain fought a war that lasted for almost 100 years with all the gold they found. So again, there's massive amounts of gold and silver that Spain found, and that led all the other European nations to suddenly start scrambling for a piece of the action themselves. The next group that made an impact were the French. The French originally came in, a guy named Jacques Cartier. That is a name on your study guide, I believe. Yes, Jacques Cartier. But Jacques Cartier, as you can see here in the 1530s, sort of came here about where the Vikings had been and kind of fiddled about and then left. And then he came back the following year and he got about as far as where Montreal is today before leaving again. He's looking for gold. He's not finding any. No gold, sad face. And they'll never find any gold in what's called New France. Eventually, other French explorers will pick up where Cartier left off. You see Champlain in the Great Lakes, Marquette and Joliet, and then, of course, the greatest of the French explorers, La Salle. La Salle became the first European to transverse the entire Mississippi River from 1679 to 1682. Again, wherever a French explorer goes, he's claiming that territory for the French. So there is going to be some conflict between the Spanish and the French over this portion of the country, right? La Salle would also eventually go into Texas where he would be killed. And if you've been to the Bob Bullock Museum, they have one of La Salle's ships that was raised up out of the Gulf of Mexico at the Bullock Museum there on the first floor. But La Salle coming into Texas and dying here somewhere out in East Texas in 1687. And this is one of La Salle's maps. And you can see here, the French will eventually grab this territory. So Spanish Florida, and then of course Spain will have everything going all the way up to California, but the French will take massive amounts of Canada and the Mississippi Valley and part of what we now call the Midwest. The French did not find any gold, but what they did find was fur. And so it will not be gold that is the main export to France, it will be fur. And so a lot of these forts out here, Fort Antone, Fort St. Louis, Fort Detroit, those are going to be fur trading stations where the fur traders will bring in their fur. Because France is getting fur from the New World, France needs to form an economic partnership with Native Americans. The whole fur trade means that needs Native Americans. Okay? And so that's going to be a very different relationship that the French have compared to the Spanish. Spain's Native American policy at first was basically enslavement. That'll change later. England's Native American policy will be to push the natives further and further out. But for the French, it will be a partnership, okay? Because the fur trade needs Native Americans. And so they will treat the natives as equals. And that's going to have a profound effect on British and American history that we'll get to towards the end of this unit and also in Unit 2. So that's the French. They do spread out quite a bit, and their main economic good is fur. The English had gotten a pretty quick jump after Columbus. As you can see here, Cabot in 1497 coming down here, but he didn't really find a lot. He's kind of in the same area the Vikings had been in way back in the turn of the millennium. But in terms of farming, there's just not a whole lot there. The only thing he did find of interest was fish. Right in this area, there's what's called the Grand Banks. It's kind of a super highway of fish. And so for the English, it will be fishing. From 1500 to 1550, massive, about 400 fishing vessels per season will come out here and fish in the Grand Banks. They will have to set up drying operations on land. So either up here in Greenland or over here. And so that means that the first real contact between Englishmen and Native Americans was through these fishermen, which is kind of amazing. But most of them were illiterate, so we really don't have their stories very much. But they would have been the ones who would have had first contact with Native Americans amongst the English. England failed to colonize any further after the Cabots, mainly because of religious and political turmoil in England from about 1550 until about 1585. There was a lot of overturn religiously, there was a lot of overturn politically. So let me briefly sort of walk us through this. The English king Henry VIII wanted to have a son. There had been one attempt to leave the English throne to a woman, and it had led to a civil war. So Henry really wanted a son. Unfortunately, Henry's wife, through no fault of her own, kept having daughters. This was Catherine of Aragon. And she just kept having one daughter after another. So Henry wants a divorce. The Pope says, no way. So Henry does a completely reasonable thing and simply breaks England. Oh, look at that typing. Breaks England away from Catholicism and founds the Church of England with the monarch in charge. That seems perfectly reasonable if you can't get a divorce to simply pull your country away from its religion and found a new religion, putting yourself at the very top. Henry is going to go through 5 more wives, okay? Anne Boleyn and some other people. This breaking from the Catholic Church, that's 1527. That's not an important date, but just to keep the story going. He'll go through 5 more wives. And the way we remember this is divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. That's how we keep the fate of Henry's 6 wives clear. Divorced Catherine, beheaded Anne, and then there's a couple others, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. He does get one son, King Edward VI, whose reign lasts only a few years before he dies. The R stands for reign. That is how long he was king. He was very sickly, and so he died pretty young. At that point, Queen Mary I took over her reign, 1553 to 1558. She turned the whole country back to Catholicism. She's also known as Bloody Mary. Those of you, people who didn't want to be Catholic, she had them put to death. If you're familiar with Fox's Book of Martyrs, talks a lot about the people who were put to death. The first man to translate the Bible into English was put to death. These people were usually burned at the stake, which is what you do with heretics. Queen Mary died in 1558, probably from a cyst on her ovarian, on her ovaries. And that gets us, Queen Elizabeth I, who will reign from 1558 to 1603. And everybody's going back to the Church of England. Okay. So if you've noticed here, we've had we've had a king, another king, a queen, and then another queen. I mean, from 1547 to 1558, in the space of barely 10 years, we're on our third monarch and we're on our third religion. Edward had been Church of England. Then we all went back to being Catholics and couldn't have meat on Fridays. And then we all went back to the Church of England and could have a nice steak on Friday. So a lot of religious turmoil, a lot of political turmoil is the reason why England does not colonize after, or doesn't colonize during its fishing period. The fishing stuff is still going on during this period, but there's no further attempt at colonization because England is just simply too unstable. Remember, power has to be centralized into a single monarch. Okay? And there's simply been too much turmoil for one monarch to really get a grip on things. But Elizabeth is going to have a nice long reign, okay, 1558 to 1603, 45 years. That makes her the third longest reign of any monarch of England. Second place being Queen Victoria, first place being the recently departed Queen Elizabeth II. So it'll be during Elizabeth I's reign that England will start looking at colonizing the New World. Why is that? In the 1570s, look to the New World for colonization. And there are three reasons. First of all, Spain had destroyed Antwerp. Okay, now Antwerp is in the Netherlands, and Antwerp was the capital of textile industry. Okay, so cotton, linen, silk, those type of things. All the innovation came from Antwerp. You can think of Antwerp as sort of the Silicon Valley of the textile industry. So new methods of making the silk, new methods or cotton, new methods of dyeing, of adding color, all of that would have taken place in Antwerp. So if you were an Englishman looking to invest, well, Antwerp was the place to invest. It was like Silicon Valley. You know, some company may have a new process for making silk. I'm going to invest in that company, right? Some company has figured out how to get purple dye to look even more purpley. You might invest in that company. The problem is that Antwerp is now a smoking hole in the ground. And so a lot of that investment money isn't going to go to Antwerp. It's going to go to colonies in the New World. Okay, so that's reason number one. We got a lot of investment money and we got no place to invest it. So it's going to go to the New World. Second, England, even the whole of Great Britain, is very small. You could drive from South England, the southernmost point of England, to the northernmost point of England in about 8 to 10 hours. So as the middle and upper classes were having families, lots of sons, little land for inheritances. So the oldest son might inherit all the land, but what do you do about the second son, the third son, the fourth son, the fifth son, the sixth son? You can probably push one of them into the military. You can probably get one of them into the church. That still leaves you some kids who aren't going to inherit land. So a lot of these sons who aren't going to inherit land are going to come to America because there's lots of land in America. So, for instance, the founder of Massachusetts is a guy named John Winthrop. He was like the fourth son in his family, so he wasn't going to really inherit very much. He comes to Boston. He becomes one of the largest landholders in early Massachusetts. Okay? So we're going to see a lot of that. Third, strategic reasons. England is, of course, an island. Let me find a different map. Yes, England here is an island, and that means you can blockade the island if you have a large enough navy. Spain had a large navy because of all the gold that Spain found. There was also a chance of war breaking out between England and Spain literally at almost any moment. Now, eventually, England and Spain will go to war, but the threat is constantly there. And if Spain has a large navy, Spain might surround England. But if England existed in America as well, if this was England, but this was also England, Spain would have to spread its navy out and that would help England. If a war broke out, Spain would have to send part of its army. Let's say this war does break out eventually between England and Spain. Spain will have to send part of its navy over here, and that will relieve some of the pressure on England itself if a war does break out. So England starts looking to the New World for colonization. Again, we have investment monies. It's not going to Antwerp, so it'll go to America. We have a shortage of land among the middle and upper classes. We have a lot of sons, very little land for inheritance. And then we have these strategic reasons, Spain's very large army and navy. If England is in multiple places, then Spain will have to be in multiple places, and that will relieve the pressure on the mother country. So So where to first? Well, the first grant of land is given to Sir Humphrey Gilbert. Now, he's going to die before he ever gets to America, but it will be his idea to send to America the English poor and English religious centers. Okay. Again, Elizabeth had switched everything back to the Church of England, but she allowed for religious minorities like the Puritans, the Baptists, the Quakers, things like that. So Sir Gilbert came up with the idea of we can send our poor people to America and we can send our religious dissenters to America as well. Now, Sir Gilbert will die before he ever gets to put this into action. So it will actually be his brother, Walter Raleigh, who will found the first English colony Roanoke colony in 1585. Roanoke is here. It's off the coast of North Carolina, the Channel Islands out here. It's a really bad spot for a colony. There was a drought going on in Roanoke during that period. So it's going to be hard to feed the colonies. The natives in the area were also kind of already pissed off at the English. There had been some encounters before, and they had not been pleasant for the natives. So they were already in kind of a bad mood. The colony was cut off. Actually, the governor of the colony went back to England to get more supplies, and the war finally broke out between England and Spain. And so the colony was cut off, and a rescue ship did not show up till 1590. Colony deserted, no bodies, no clues. And so the people of Roanoke simply disappearing into history. We have no idea definitively what happened to them. There's a lot of theories. There's been a lot of digs. There's been a lot of speculation, but no one knows exactly for sure what exactly happened. So A for effort, England, but very much an F on follow through. In the next video, we will look at the Chesapeake, which is the Virginia region, which is a little bit north of where Roanoke is at. And I will see you in that next video. All righty. And we will stop this now. Thank you.